The word that's probably been used to lazily describe the Charlatans more than any other is survivors. To be fair, they've faced more than their fair share of adversity and tragedy in the last 30 years, facing things such as Rob Collins, their keyboard player's imprisonment and then later death following a tragic road accident, the loss of their drummer John Brookes to a brain tumour, and at one point they were swindled out of £300,000 by their own accountant. And of course they survived being bundled into two of the most dating subgenres of the 90s. The early 90s Madchester baggy movement and the mid-90s Brit Pop scene. But that term survivors has always bothered me. It's often felt loaded with a particularly dismissive sentiment. That being, some bands thrive, but you just survived. It's time that that narrative, that story, was retold. Because the point isn't the fact that they survived all of that. The point is, how did they survive all of that? And they did it by writing a boatload of brilliant music that deserves far more recognition than it gets. Welcome to 2020 Sound, the channel where we take a look back at the underrated and overlooked in indie and alternative rock history. If that sounds like something you'd like to watch more videos about, then do please subscribe. Now, when you're a band that's part of a bigger scene, that can often serve to propel you to much bigger commercial success than you may have expected otherwise. But quite often, unless you are perceived to be at the forefront of that scene, then your shelf life is more likely to have more in common with a bottle of milk than a bottle of wine. That's where I think a lot of this survivor narrative comes from. The Charlatans were always presented as the bridesmaids of the baggy scene and the Britpop scene, never the brides. To this day, the group are rarely taken on their own terms, their merits often still judged next to those of their contemporaries, the Stone Roses especially. And whilst it's true that they've never had that one seismic album that acted as a touchstone for an entire generation, it's kind of saying the obvious, but they've had a much more productive career than most of their contemporaries, the Stone Roses especially. But this isn't about quantity over quality, it's about quantity of quality. And when you take a look back at everything that the Charlatans have done over the last 30 years, they've built for themselves a catalogue of songs that's staggeringly impressive. I've got a playlist that I'm slowly putting pretty much every single song that I've ever liked on, and it's become a brutally efficient way for me to actually judge just how much or how little I actually care for a musician or a band. Obviously, some bands create albums where the songs work best together as an album, and to take them out of that context is a little unfair, but generally speaking, it's a ruthlessly effective method. And the Charlatans are one such band who, through this process, I've come to realise just how many of their songs I absolutely love and felt I absolutely had to include on this playlist. And not just the obvious hits, although special mention goes to One to Another for having one of the greatest piano riffs I've ever heard. And I've got to tip my hat to Weirdo for its organ stabs that I recall being memorably described by the brilliant John Robb as sounding so aggressive it made him feel like he was being mugged. The songs I wanted to focus on are the ones that stand as a testament to the depth of quality that lays below the hits in their back catalogue. First on my list being the brooding brilliance of the title track of their third album, Up to Our Hips, as well as boasting probably my all-time favourite keyboard riff. It creates this dark, unsettling mood that really stands at odds with the cheeriness of most Britpop at that time. It's like they were trying to write a trip-hop tune but using guitars and live drums instead of samplers and sequencers. It's got a creeping gloom to its groove, and it feels like it's trying to evoke something similar to Massive Attack's more threatening moments. Midnight rockers, city slickers, or even DJ Shadow. They'd go even further into this territory 5 years later on the song Forever. but they did it first, and in my opinion best, on Up to Our Hips. Which is kind of interesting that they sound so directly inspired by trip hop here, a genre built on samplers, evolving music technology, at a time when the band seemed very focused on keeping things much more raw. From 1994 to 1997, they released what I call, in my head, and I've never said it out loud before, the Dirty Trilogy. Reason being, I'm sure I read a quote somewhere from John Brookes saying that he was looking forward to getting in the studio with producer Steve Hillage and getting more dirt on the tape. Something a bit more live and gritty and raw than the more processed sounds that they had with Flood on their previous album between 10th and 11th. And that approach sits at the heart of those three albums, Up to Our Hips, The Charlatans, and Telling Stories, which saw engineer Dave Charles stepping up to take over production duties. While a lot of the Brit Pop bands sounded like they were aiming to write a Hey Jude or a Yesterday, something with big sing-along melodies, it sounded at this point like the Charlatans were aiming more for a Sympathy for the Devil. There's a real rootsiness to this music, with Brookes and Martin Blunt's rhythm section really coming alive in the music at this time. It sounds like they're capturing a lot of dirt on the tape, and things don't get much dirtier than Toothpick off the self-titled album. Built on a phenomenal guitar riff from Mark Collins, which ranks as one of the filthiest I've ever heard. Toothpick sounds like it's straight from the swamp. It's got serious Dr. John down in the bayou casting voodoo vibes about it, and whatever voodoo it's casting, it's kept me well under its spell for decades now. The 90s, of course, was the era of the CD single, a time when bands realised that they had to create 3 B-sides in order to fill out the format. Now often that meant that they would pad things out with remixes and, generally the sound of scraping the barrel. But some bands built a reputation on writing B-sides that were actually worth owning. Sometimes songs that were even better than the A-side. Suede and Oasis are the first names that come to mind when I think of those kinds of bands, but the Charlatans had some amazing B-sides as well. The one that I particularly wanted to focus on being Title Fight. To me, it's the sound of them at their most cocksure and their most defiant. It was the B-side to the equally brilliant How High, and coming out a year after Rob's death, you can't help but read that into the lyrics somewhat, even though I'm sure he would have actually been working on it in his final few months. Tim Burgess's lyrics speak of the fear of losing someone you love.
How could I ever want to disown you? I want to love and have and hold you.
And compensating for that darkness with a swagger and conviction.
Always look for the positive, I don't feel a pain when I'm watching the title fight.
It's got a confidence that's tinged with melancholy, but the confidence is the overriding emotion. But 2 years later, they would flip that dynamic on the song that probably contains my absolute favourite moment across all the Charlatans' discography. That song is Senses, and that moment follows the calm before the storm as the harmonica and the acoustic guitar gently ebb away, fade to silence, and then the band and Tim just kick back in.
You're my sweet black angel, laughing on my shoulder.
It's like a gut punch for me every time I hear it. It's one of his absolute best vocals. The song basks in this loss, but it's not fragile. It's so emotive, but it has this towering confidence and dignity, helped in no small part by Tony Rogers' amazing keyboard part, which gives it this Led Zeppelin-like stature and gravitas. It was an incredible song to help bring the curtain down on the band's first decade. As with most groups around for any length of time after the millennium, the media spotlight fell more on other groups, the press coverage became less frequent, the radio playlist placements became less prominent. But that hasn't stopped the band from making some fantastic music in those subsequent years. Particular highlights for me including Black and Blue Eyes, which is just tremendous. It's one of the most dramatic songs they've ever done, and it makes me feel like I'm in a training montage in an 80s Rocky movie every time I hear it.
Black and blue eyes that don't care to...
You Cross My Path, again one of their absolute best singles. Irons out their trademark groove into a more propulsive rhythm which hammers the song into your eardrums, along with these angular, Gang of Four-ish guitars and a seething venom in the chorus. They've done a really good job of creating a distinctive sound while still evolving. They're always pushing. They're not just rehashing past glories. And on 2017's Different Days, it feels like they're capturing a lot of the joyousness of their earliest period, the Some Friendly era, but doing it in a way where they're using really fresh sounds, you know, fresh electronic textures and arpeggios and beats. People really want to talk about surviving, and let's talk about what that often comes down to in nature. Survival of the fittest. What's fitness in musical terms? A lot of pop groups and rock bands, they treat music as a 100-meter sprint, you know? You burn hard, you burn fast, you burn bright, and then after a couple of years you fall apart or you just splutter and run out of juice. The Charlatans are long-distance runners. They've got stamina. And sure, there may be a few times in the race where their legs wobble a bit, but they're running a race where, if you're paying attention, there's plenty of bursts of brilliance. Madchester, Brit Pop, they're better than those scenes. They don't belong to those pigeonholes. In the words of no one, not even the rain, and there's no denying, they absolutely did. Thanks for watching. Let me know your favourite overlooked Charlatan songs in the comments. If you enjoy this video, then do please give it a like and share it with anyone else who you think may enjoy it as well. And if you'd be interested in watching more videos all about underrated and overlooked music from indie and alternative rock history, then do please subscribe.